The camera moves slowly through fog. London, 1940. The distant rumble of German bombers. Searchlights cut through smoke-filled skies. The city is burning. But we are not going to the streets. We are going somewhere else. Somewhere the cameras never showed. The camera descends through clouds, through smoke, through the veil of propaganda, and arrives at a nondescript building in Whitehall. Inside, men in suits sit around a mahogany table. No uniforms here, no generals. These are the men who count the money. On the table before them, a single document, 3 pages. The numbers on those pages will determine whether Britain survives the next 6 months. The document is a balance sheet, and the balance sheet says Britain is already dead. Fade to black. Text appears. In war, truth is the first casualty. In victory, the invoice arrives. Fade back in. We are told a story about World War II. It is a story of courage, of sacrifice, of a small island nation standing alone against the darkness of fascism. Churchill's speeches, the Blitz spirit, Dunkirk, the few. This story is true, but it is incomplete. There's another story, a story that was never meant to be told. A story of ledgers and loans, of collateral and coercion, of an empire being dismantled, not by enemy bombs, but by friendly bankers. This is the story of how the United States bankrupted the British Empire, not through conquest, through credit. To understand what happened, we must go back before the war, before the bombs fell, before Churchill, to a moment when Britain still believed itself invincible. In 1939, the British Empire was the largest political entity in human history. It controlled a quarter of the world's land, a quarter of its population. It possessed the most powerful navy ever built. Its currency, the pound sterling, was the language of global trade, the measure by which all other values were calculated. But empires are expensive, and Britain, beneath the pageantry, was already weakened. The First World War had cost Britain dearly, not just in blood, though that cost was catastrophic, but in treasure. Britain had borrowed heavily to finance that war, and the debts had never fully healed. The Great Depression had struck British industry hard. Unemployment remained high. The treasury was strained. When war came again in 1939, Britain faced a terrible arithmetic. The nation could fight or it could eat. It could not do both. The weapons required to defeat Nazi Germany did not exist in British factories. The steel, the oil, the aluminum, the machinery. Britain did not have enough. It would need to buy these things, and there was only one nation on earth capable of supplying them: America. The relationship between Britain and America in 1940 was not the alliance we imagine today. It was a transaction, and America intended to profit. Franklin Delano Roosevelt understood the war in Europe as an opportunity. Not an opportunity for glory. Roosevelt was too sophisticated for that, but an opportunity for position, for leverage, for the rearrangement of global power. America in 1940 was officially neutral. The Neutrality Acts, passed by an isolationist Congress, prohibited the sale of weapons to belligerent nations on credit. If Britain wanted American arms, Britain would have to pay cash, and Britain would have to carry those arms in British ships. This was called cash and carry. It sounded fair. It was designed to bleed Britain dry. The British government began liquidating everything. Gold reserves that had taken centuries to accumulate were shipped across the Atlantic. British companies with American subsidiaries were forced to sell at prices set by American buyers. Cordalds, the textile giant, Lever Brothers, Shell Oil's American operations. One by one, the crown jewels of British commerce were auctioned off to pay for survival. By the end of 1940, Britain had spent over $4.5 billion, a figure almost incomprehensible at the time. The treasury was approaching empty, and the war had barely begun. Churchill knew this. In December 1940, he wrote to Roosevelt directly. The letter was not released to the public. It was too desperate, too revealing. In it, Churchill laid bare the truth. Britain was running out of money. Without American help, the war would be lost. Not on the battlefield, in the bank. Roosevelt read the letter, and he saw his moment. What emerged was called Lend-Lease. It was announced to the American public as an act of generosity, a way for America to help Britain without entering the war directly. Roosevelt compared it to lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house was on fire. You didn't sell the hose, you lent it. And when the fire was out, you got it back. It was a masterful piece of political theater, and it was a lie. Lend-Lease was not a gift. It was not even a loan in the traditional sense. It was a mechanism for transferring British assets to American control while maintaining the appearance of alliance. The terms were extraordinary. Britain would receive American weapons, food, and material. In exchange, Britain would grant America access to British military bases around the world. Britain would open its markets to American goods. Britain would share its technological secrets, including advances in radar, jet propulsion, and nuclear research. And when the war ended, Britain would owe America for everything that had been lent. The garden hose was not being lent. It was being sold, and the price was the British Empire itself. Consider what was actually transferred during Lend-Lease. Not just weapons. Though America sent billions of dollars worth of tanks, aircraft, and ammunition, America also sent food. By 1944, nearly a third of British calories came from American imports. The nation that had ruled a quarter of the world could not feed itself without American permission. America sent oil. British military vehicles ran on American gasoline. British warships burned American fuel. The Royal Navy, that legendary instrument of imperial power, was dependent on American refineries for its ability to move. America sent machine tools, the equipment needed to manufacture weapons. British factories were retooled with American machinery, making them dependent on American parts, American expertise, American supply chains. This was not aid, it was infrastructure capture. America was not helping Britain win the war. America was making Britain unable to function without American support. And there was another provision, buried in the technical language of the Lend-Lease agreements. Article 7. It required Britain to work toward the elimination of discriminatory treatment in international commerce. In plain language, Britain would have to dismantle the system of imperial preference, the trade arrangements that bound the British Empire together economically. The empire was being liquidated from within, by contract, while British soldiers died fighting its enemies. The men who negotiated these terms understood exactly what they were doing. On the American side sat figures like Dean Acheson and Harry Dexter White, men who believed in American power and American destiny. They saw the war as a chance to build a new international order, with America at its center. Britain, in their view, was a declining power clinging to outdated imperial structures. The war would accelerate what history had already decreed. On the British side sat John Maynard Keynes, the greatest economist of his generation, perhaps of any generation. Keynes understood money as others understood poetry. He could see the architecture of financial systems, their hidden load-bearing walls, their points of structural failure. And he saw what America was building. Keynes fought against the harshest American demands. He argued that destroying Britain economically would destabilize the post-war world. He warned that an impoverished Britain could not be a reliable partner. He proposed alternative arrangements, joint currencies, shared reserves, genuine cooperation rather than creditor dominance. He lost every major battle. The Americans held the leverage. Britain needed American supplies to survive the next month, the next week, the next day. You cannot negotiate from weakness. You can only accept terms. Keynes returned to London after each round of negotiations, looking older, grayer, more exhausted. Those who knew him said something had broken inside. He was watching the empire he had served being dismantled by allies, and he was powerless to stop it. The war ground on. Britain survived. But survival came at a price measured in more than blood. By 1945, Britain had accumulated debts of staggering proportions. The national debt had risen from £7.1 billion in 1939 to £21.4 billion, a tripling in 6 years. Interest payments alone would consume a significant portion of government revenue for decades to come. But the debt to America was only part of the problem. Britain had also borrowed from its colonies, from India, from Egypt, from the sterling area nations that had supplied material and manpower for the war effort. These sterling balances represented obligations totaling over £3 billion. Britain owed money to the very colonies it claimed to rule. The empire was no longer profitable. It had become a liability. And then the war ended. And America collected. In August 1945, President Harry Truman canceled Lend-Lease. The announcement came with almost no warning. One day, supplies were flowing. The next day, ships already at sea were ordered to turn around. Contracts were canceled. Invoices were sent. Britain had expected a transition period. It had expected American generosity to continue, at least for a time. It had expected gratitude. It received a bill. The Truman administration calculated that Britain owed approximately $650 million for Lend-Lease supplies in the pipeline. This debt would need to be serviced. Additionally, Britain would need new loans to survive the immediate post-war period, to feed its population, to rebuild its industry, to maintain some semblance of its former position. Keynes was dispatched to Washington once more. He arrived believing he could negotiate a grant, a recognition of British sacrifice, a gesture of Allied solidarity. He was offered a loan. The terms of the Anglo-American Loan Agreement of 1945 revealed the true nature of the relationship. Britain would receive $3.75 billion. In exchange, Britain would pay 2% interest over 50 years. Britain would ratify the Bretton Woods agreements, accepting the dollar as the world's reserve currency. Britain would make the pound convertible within 1 year, allowing anyone holding pounds to exchange them for dollars. This last provision was a death sentence, and Keynes knew it. Convertibility meant that all the sterling balances held by Britain's creditors, India, Egypt, the Middle Eastern nations, could suddenly be converted into dollars. Britain did not have enough dollar reserves to cover these obligations. The moment convertibility began, there would be a run on the pound. Keynes argued against this provision with everything he had. He explained the mathematics to American negotiators who understood them perfectly well. He was asking America to show mercy. America was not in the mercy business. The loan agreement was signed. Keynes returned to England. Within months, he was dead, his heart giving out after years of strain. Some said he died knowing what was coming. On July 15, 1947, Britain made the pound convertible, as required by the agreement. Within 6 weeks, foreign holders of sterling rushed to exchange their pounds for dollars. Britain's reserves hemorrhaged at a rate of over $100 million per week. In just 37 days, Britain was forced to suspend convertibility, but not before losing a significant portion of its remaining reserves. The pound never recovered its former status. The world had seen its weakness. The dollar was now supreme. What followed was a generation of managed decline. The British Empire dissolved not with a bang, but with a series of accounting entries. India, the jewel of the crown, gained independence in 1947, not purely because of nationalism, though that mattered, but because Britain could no longer afford to hold it. Palestine was abandoned in 1948. Egypt was lost by 1956. The Suez Crisis of 1956 provided the final, humiliating proof of Britain's new position. When Britain and France attempted to seize the Suez Canal from Egypt, Eisenhower simply threatened to crash the pound. No armies were needed. No shots were fired between allies. America gave an order, and Britain obeyed. Prime Minister Anthony Eden was destroyed by Suez. He resigned within months, broken by the realization that Britain could no longer act independently on the world stage. The empire that had defeated Napoleon, that had ruled the seas for 2 centuries, had been brought to heel by a telephone call from Washington. This was the new world order, not declared in treaties, enforced through finance. The long-term consequences shaped the second half of the 20th century. Britain continued paying its American war debts until December 31, 2006. 61 years after the war ended, the final payment was made, quietly, without ceremony, a last installment on an invoice that had been accumulating interest since before most Britons were born. The British economy stagnated through the 1950s and 1960s, while Germany and Japan, defeated nations, occupied nations, experienced miraculous growth. This was not coincidence. America invested heavily in former enemies, rebuilding them as markets for American goods and bulwarks against Soviet expansion. Britain, already captured financially, received less attention. The pound was devalued repeatedly. 1949, 1967, 1976. Each devaluation was an admission of weakness, a signal to the world that Britain could not defend its own currency without American support. By the 1970s, Britain was borrowing from the International Monetary Fund, accepting conditions that constrained its domestic policy. The former master of global finance was now a supplicant. The City of London, that ancient center of world commerce, survived, but as a secondary node in a system centered on New York. British banks served American interests. British markets operated within American frameworks. The special relationship, so celebrated in public, was in private a relationship between creditor and debtor. And what of America? The nation that had entered World War II late, that had suffered relatively modest casualties, that had never faced bombing raids or occupation? This nation emerged as master of the world. The dollar became the global reserve currency, a position it holds to this day. American military bases spread across the globe, occupying the strategic positions that British bases had once held. American corporations dominated world markets, having purchased British competitors at discount prices during the war years. The institutions that governed the post-war world, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the United Nations, were headquartered in America, structured to serve American interests, weighted to give American votes the greatest influence. This was not conspiracy. This was contract law. The terms had been negotiated in rooms where America held all the leverage. The mechanisms developed to dismantle the British Empire were subsequently applied worldwide. Nations seeking independence from colonial powers found themselves dependent on American credit. Development loans came with conditions, open markets, favorable trade terms, political alignment with American interests. The colonialism of territory was replaced by the colonialism of debt. This system persists. The cameras that recorded VE Day showed crowds celebrating in London and New York. They showed soldiers embracing, flags waving, Churchill flashing his victory sign. They did not show the documents being signed in Washington. They did not show the gold leaving the Bank of England. They did not show the slow, quiet transfer of power from one empire to another. History remembers World War II as a triumph of democracy over fascism. This is true, but it is not the whole truth. The war was also a business transaction. And in business transactions, someone always pays. Britain paid with its treasure. It paid with its empire. It paid with its position in the world. It paid for 61 years after the last shot was fired. The Americans called it assistance. The British called it alliance. The accountants called it what it was. A debt that could never fully be repaid. A transfer of power disguised as partnership. A victory that was also a surrender. The camera pulls back. We are in that wood-paneled room in Whitehall again, 1940. The same men sit around the same table looking at the same terrible numbers. They know what is coming. They know the price that will be extracted. They sign the papers anyway, because the alternative is annihilation. Outside, the bombs continue to fall. London is burning. The empire is burning. But the real destruction is happening in conference rooms and banking halls in the dry language of loan covenants and convertibility clauses. It is happening in places the cameras never go, in documents the public will never see. Fade to black. Winston Churchill declared that Britain would fight on the beaches, in the fields, in the streets. He promised that Britain would never surrender. He was wrong. Britain surrendered in Washington in 1945 to an ally who presented the terms as friendship and the invoice as a favor.